It is 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll keep this introduction short because I know we have a lot of content to cover today. We are delighted to welcome Joan Biebelhausen and John Tinula from the Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and I will turn it over to you right now.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We're delighted to be here and appreciate all of you coming to this program. John and I are bringing you a program that qualifies under the new credit, and it's just a matter of time before this one gets approved because it's a program we've done several times and it has been approved. So before we get started, I would just like to have us come present into the room and think about being here for this hour as you think about the stress you have in your life as a lawyer. We all do. Maybe you're not a lawyer, you're another legal professional, and you're watching this, and that's okay. You're drinking from the same fire hose. Um, and be present for some of the things we're going to share so that you have some ideas if you're concerned about someone else, so that you can kind of find a way through something that might be stressful. And so I'd invite you just to make yourself comfortable, and we're going to talk about the breath. And we're going to talk about how when you inhale, your heart rate goes up. And when you exhale, your heart rate goes down. And so you can kind of reset. So let's just do this once. Inhale for 4 counts. And then exhale for 8. There are many variations on a breathing exercise, but what always happens with me is that my shoulders go down and the room gets quieter. So John and I are happy to be here today. I'm Joan Biebelhausen, the director at LCL. And John, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Thanks, Joan. I'm John Tinula. I'm a client services director here at LCL. I have a long history with the organization. I've been involved in and around the hallowed halls of LCL for something over 20 years. And I will mention, because there are comments that I might make through the presentation that might not make sense, I'm also a person in recovery. I've been in recovery for 24 years. And back in the day, my first call was to LCL. So that may come up from time to time.
All right, thanks, John. Well, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with the idea that pretty much all of us got into this profession because we wanted to make some sort of difference. And so while we might lose track of it sometimes, this really should be a perspective of how do we care for each other? How do we take care of ourselves so that we can do our best work and provide our best support, whether it's parties or clients or in some other kind of setting. We're going to talk about the kinds of things that can give rise to the challenges we face, stress and trauma. We're going to talk about substance use, mental health issues to kind of give you a primer on that so you kind of see how it affects us and when it's time to be concerned and what resources are available. We're going to talk about what else can we do to reduce our risk, well-being strategies, as well as the services of Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And actually, I'm going to start with a little bit of that. LCL is a free confidential resource that provides free counseling to all legal professionals. That includes paralegals, it's all of you, and immediate family members on any issue that causes stress or distress. And we have a 24-hour hotline. If your question can't wait until business hours, we provide free counseling. We have a number of support groups. We have peer support. We do education like this to try and reduce our risk. So there's a lot going on, and I hope that you'll see us as a resource for you throughout your career. Now let's take a look at, let's start out talking about stress. And I'm not going to go through each of these items, but the point is that if we were to go back about 5 years and we'd look at what is stressful for us, these are the things on this list that have kind of arisen more in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, we didn't really know about something called a pandemic. And we've had more awareness of racial and social justice. And there's been, it seems, more, the communications are more difficult around all of the challenges in our society. And we have people who are struggling because they may have relatives in the southeastern states that have been impacted by the hurricane, or in the Middle East, or in other settings where trauma is going on locally. And so they may become our clients, they may be our coworkers, they may be us. And the other part about all of these things is our profession is on the front lines. We are the ones who are making the policies, trying to solve the problems, because ultimately we are problem solvers, and that's what we try to do. And so we're out there experiencing this. And when we think about stress in the legal profession, we know about things like billable hours and difficult clients and all of those kinds of environmental things. But then there are some more internal aspects that are what we bring. And these are things that can impact our ability to feel like we can ask for help or to feel that we're doing what we should be doing because we doubt ourselves. And so the first one on this list is the idea that we strive for perfection. I think I remember a warning in law school that early on that if you miss a statute of limitations, you could be sued for malpractice, you could lose your license, that you had to make sure that you didn't miss anything. And so we go for that. I have to be perfect. I can't make any mistakes. All while we have an opposing counsel who's trying to point out all the ways that we are not, or that our case is not, but we internalize that. And then we also look for the dark side. That's what we get paid for. We are paid to look for the worst that could possibly happen. So if you're putting together a lawsuit, you're going to be looking for every possible damage. And if you're looking to defend it, you're looking to minimize every damage. And so we're looking for the worst that could happen. So we want to anticipate it and either prevent it or recover for it. But we take that into our personal lives sometimes. And both of these things, perfection and pessimism, can be predictors for unhealthy behaviors and coping mechanisms, as well as things like depression. We also deal with isolation and uncertainty, and they kind of come together because without connections, we may not be sure of ourselves and second guess ourselves or be unable to function. And John, I want you to talk about that for just a minute because I think you've got some good comments on isolation.
Sure. So we actually do a program that relates to isolation and loneliness in the profession of law. A recent report by the Attorney General of the United States said that Americans report being lonely. About 40% of us do, and that's a very, very large percentage, which the Attorney General found very alarming. The Harvard Business Review recently reported that lawyers are the loneliest workers in America. So you combine the fact that as a nation we're more isolated, this profession is even more isolated. We tend to work in silos. We're encouraged to do it ourselves. All of those things um, uh, can be really, really tough on us. And a lot of the data, and this, by the way, isn't just in this particular report, it cites to lots of studies that have been done over the years. Loneliness and isolation has significant and negative impacts on our mental health and on our physical health. And it's been identified as being just as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It was a statistic that I had to read a couple of times because it seems so startling to me. But it's a very, very serious problem. And you know, when you put that in combination with the first two things, Joan, that you talked about, that perfectionism, the pessimism, it all sort of adds to this potentially toxic soup in our profession in terms of our mental health and our physical health, and why these programs are so important.
And so we're starting this by kind of really giving you all the evidence and the information because you need all the information in order to be able to make considered decisions. So that's really what this is all about. But that uncertainty causes us to second guess ourselves. We also are exposed to other people's trauma, and sometimes we have entered this profession because of that trauma. And John's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But before that, I just want to acknowledge some human stressors. These are the kinds of things that affect absolutely every one of us, but in different ways. And sometimes a moment of grace for a colleague can make a huge difference. Some of us are still working remotely all of the time or part of the time. And, you know, are you working from home or are you living at work? And people will feel guilty because they're not doing enough work, they're not doing enough stuff with family because you really don't have a clear boundary. When do I stop? And so if that is a challenge for you, look for ways to establish those touchstones where you are actually leaving one and being fully present for the other. That mindfulness exercise I gave you, as brief as it was, is something where you could say, okay, I'm home now. This is who I'm talking to. All of the stressors from earlier in the day, I have ways to deal with those. I may need to deal with those, but I am present for my family and it's not going to spill over. And sometimes it does. And that's why sometimes we need to do things like talk to counselors. Um, there are a multitude of transitions we might go through. I just put a program together on that I did last week. And these are going to be personal transitions. So they might be having a child go to college or becoming a parent, as well as professional transitions where it might be a different job or a change in your job. And they all come with their stressors. And sometimes it's not so hard, and sometimes it is a struggle. We all have our unique family needs, whether it's a parenthood, a child with special needs, older generation that we need to take care of, making our own decisions about that, our health, our involvement in our community. All of those things are stressors that we sort of push aside because they aren't related to our work. But sometimes they can have an impact, and there's help for that too. So, John, I want to have you kind of take us through talking about trauma with, the understanding I said earlier that some of us come to this profession because of trauma. We want to make a difference because of that trauma. And other times it's what we experience once we're here, and sometimes it's both.
So trauma is obviously a very, very big topic, and it's a topic of interest in the law. There's lots of discussions about the trauma-informed lawyer and how we approach our clients who may have experienced trauma. Trauma can be something that's happened to us. It can be something that's happened to someone close to us. It can be something that's happened to a client or a friend, and all of those things can affect us in ways that we don't always recognize at the time. But trauma itself is originated by an event or a series of events or a certain set of circumstances. And in essence, it's just that we have the inability to integrate that emotional experience. It overwhelms us. It exceeds our capacity to sort of cope with it. Sometimes just in the moment, right? But sometimes that sense of being overwhelmed can continue for quite some time. And sometimes it will sit underneath the surface, right? And it'll get triggered up, which we'll talk about in a minute. It can be a physical event, it can be an emotional event, and it doesn't have to be something big. We think of traumatic events like plane crashes or car accidents, or we can even think about societally relevant traumatic events like the pandemic or war. Those things clearly fall into that category of trauma. But sometimes it can be something small. And Joan, as you like to talk about, sometimes it's something that we didn't receive, that either we perceived that we needed or we in fact did need and wasn't available to us. And that's something that can linger on and continue to affect us well beyond the actual occurrence of the event itself. There are a couple of different kinds. There's that direct trauma where it's something that's experienced directly. I witnessed a car crash or I was involved in a car crash or a plane crash. There can also be secondary and vicarious trauma as well. So next slide. So let's talk a little bit about those last two categories. Secondary trauma is something where you have continual, frequent, close contact with people who have experienced direct trauma. So if you do prosecutions or you're a defense attorney, for example, you are sitting often in other people's trauma, sometimes over and over again. We talk to defense lawyers who have to look at evidence or hear accounts of things that most of us would hope we would never have to experience, much less have to listen to. But this is just part of their job. This is what you need to do. It's much more prevalent, obviously, in things like criminal law and family law, but it can come up in any context. We're trusted advisors to our clients, and often they will share things with us that are deeply, deeply personal and sometimes very, very traumatic. Judges and trial court personnel also have that same exposure. Now, vicarious trauma is maybe a little bit more removed, maybe another step removed. So that might be just exposure to reports or descriptions or photos or videos, frankly. And I think the thing to note is that lawyers as a profession often are submerged in these details much more than any other professional that's involved in it. Other people have contact with it, but we tend to be the ones that are mostly and directly involved in what happened to the client, what the event was that's giving rise to the litigation or the case before us. But appellate court judges and court personnel who are higher up the chain, who might be looking at this, also have to review these documents and can be affected as well.
I remember talking to an appellate judge who had been a trial court judge, and they said that they missed the closure that
Mm,
they got as actually seeing the people feel like they were heard. And they were more affected by reading the transcript than they had been by seeing the original testimony because they felt like they got to observe that person feeling that healing.
So triggers, I'll talk about this a couple of different ways, but triggers are really just something happens and it sets off a memory tape in our brain. We suddenly have these flashbacks of the event. We may suddenly physically react to it in a similar way that we did to the original trauma. Triggers are also heavily involved in substance use disorders. So I have plenty of those that I can point to. Sometimes people will say, well, it must be something really bad that happened. And the answer is no. I often use the example that it can be the smell of fresh cut grass because I associate that with the reward that I gave myself when I was done mowing the lawn or while I was mowing the lawn, frankly. And I don't recommend that. It's not a safe thing to do, but when you're in that state, you don't think about those sorts of things. They tend to be very personal. We don't always know that they're going to come up. I just had this example happen to me. I was at a conference last week, and when I was flying back home on the approach to the airport, something happened, and we were getting pretty close, and the plane took off again. And I got really nervous. And it took me a second to remember that I had been involved in a landing, many, many years ago, where we were basically almost onto the tarmac and the pilot took off. I mean, it just didn't make any sense. We were basically almost on the ground and he took off again and never said anything until the next day I heard on the radio that there had been a near miss at the airport with a Delta flight and named the city that was the departing city, and it was my flight. That's what had happened. There was an airplane on the tarmac at the same time we were trying to land. It caused me to remember that in a way that I was surprised. I was surprised that it actually affected like me like that in that particular moment. So sometimes, again, we're not going to know when those things might come up. It's a very personal thing and can sometimes come up in places and in ways that we don't expect. So what are the risk factors? Well, again, our personal history, we may have trauma that is similar to the trauma that we're listening to our clients describe, whether it's child abuse or sexual assault or a car accident, whatever it might be. Sometimes that trauma that they describe can trigger our own trauma response. And sometimes it may be that you heard something very similar to that a dozen times until it affected you that 13th time. You're not necessarily going to know how and when that might come up. Sometimes we represent clients on matters that we don't agree with what they're doing. We don't like that we have to defend them, but we do. That is the profession that we chose. So that creates that sort of moral dilemma in us sometimes of I am actually doing something that I am morally opposed to, but I am ethically and professionally obligated to do. Our sense of control. I mean, sometimes those sorts of triggers can be really disconcerting. We don't really know how to deal with it. It can kind of put us off balance. And then sort of personal strength, patience, and resilience. And again, I think it's really important to note that it doesn't mean you're weak if you have these reactions. It's a perfectly normal reaction. It's just hard to know, again, which thing could affect us at what point and what are the accumulation of factors. In a way, it's sort of like an allergic reaction to something. Usually our allergies are things that are buildups. It's something that you've been exposed to time and time and time again. And it is until you hit that tipping point that you actually have the full-on, full-blown body reaction to that particular allergen. Trauma can be very much the same way. And are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating well? Are you getting enough rest? All of these things can factor in. Next slide. So on a professional basis, of course, I don't need to tell this group this, but you're busy. You have a lot of work to do, and sometimes that work can seem insurmountable. There's too many cases. There's cases that are too complicated because that means you can't spend as much time on another. Some of these cases just inherently are traumatic. There are things that have happened to people that are very, very difficult for them to deal with and can often be very, very difficult for us to deal with for all the reasons we've already talked about. And we talked about isolation, but of course, again, I think as a profession, we tend to work in silos. We tend to work independently. We're encouraged to do that through law school. And you know, it's competitive and all of those things. And if we say, hey, listen, I might need help, does that reflect on our competence? There's all of these things that are sort of deeply ingrained in our system and what we do and in ourselves based on the training that we receive that can factor into this. And again, it's an adversarial system. We do battle. We put on our armor. We go to battle for our clients or on behalf of the system. And do we take that armor off? When do we take that armor? And then when we do, are we prepared for what that feels like? Are we prepared for the loss of the weight on our shoulders when we do that? And sometimes that might be the time when those things really sink in for us. And sometimes, you know what, we don't get a lot of thank you notes. We don't get a lot of attaboys or attagirls. And we don't always get those senses that what we do is appreciated. I know for myself, when I do get a thank you, I really hang on to those because I feel like they are far few and far between, and I want to make sure that I take note of those, and I always tell people how much I appreciate it. And then, listen, we're often inadequately resourced. We don't have enough paralegals or secretaries to get all of that work done that we talked about. And then it obviously will have an impact on us. It can affect how we think, our ability to think, our ability to write, writer's block. All of those things can come out of these stressful, traumatic events that we've dealt with and that we are dealing with on an ongoing basis and that we're dealing with on behalf of our clients. It can affect how we present to other people. We can be irritable. We can be short. We can be angry. It'll affect our physical health as well. That's inevitable. And it will start to strain our social relationships at home, among our colleagues, and with our friends. So we don't want to leave you with the impression that all we're going to talk about here today is the bad news. We obviously need to start by giving you really solid information about the issues that we're dealing with, because we need to make sure that we're getting that message to you. But we want to make sure you know there is good news. And despite all of the things that we've talked about, that high caseload, the trauma that we're dealing with on a daily basis, most of us, nearly most of us, are still able to handle the demands of our jobs. We're still able to get the work done on a day in and day out basis. But I do think even if we are, it's important to recognize that all of these things will have an impact on us and an impact on all of our lives. And we're going to talk a little bit later about some resilience strategies that we think can help you as you work through that. So what are the things that you can do to lessen trauma's impact? One, attend a CLE just like this. Become aware of the issues that are inherent in the practice of law and that again are different. We do want to set ourselves apart. Obviously, we want to feel special. And the answer is in many ways we really are. And particularly in the nature of the work that we do. And I think how we are able to handle that, there just unfortunately wasn't a lot of classwork back in law school that dealt with self-care. How do you deal with the actual practice of law and the stress that comes along with that? But part of that is finding some balance in your life, finding a way to let go and finding a way to get the exercise that you might need and or social interactions that you might need, which leads me to the third one, which is connection. We're going to talk about that quite a bit, but it is really, really critically important. And again, those statistics that I talked about earlier about loneliness and isolation, the opposite is true. The more connections we have, the more meaningful connections we have, the better we are able to handle all of these stresses and the more positive impact it will have on our health, both mental and physical. And then again, finally, the self-care piece, taking care of ourselves. Therapy. We're huge advocates for therapy here, and I'm a huge advocate for therapy myself. I know we sometimes have this inherent distrust of those processes, but I think they can be incredibly helpful and beneficial. And then we need to take care of our emotional self and our spiritual self and our workplace self.
John, I think there was a study done. It was called The Toll of Trauma, and it was it's the only study I'm aware of that not only looked at lawyers, but also the people they worked with. And what they found was the most effective way to mitigate the impact of trauma was decompression with colleagues. So talking with someone else who gets what you do, thinking about who in your workplace you can talk to. And this is not the can you top this kind of war stories. It's more like a genuine recognition and understanding that's like I see you and I see that you are experiencing this as well as I am, and it's hard, and acknowledging that, and that can go a long way to mitigating that impact with the understanding that there are many additional higher level options available.
Yes, thank you, John. So let's talk a little bit about stress. Trauma obviously is stressful. It's a stress, but this is, we're kind of talking a little bit about sort of that chronic condition of our practice here. The stressor, kind of like trauma or the traumatic event, is the thing that affects us. It's the workload. It's the nature of the work that we're doing. The stress is what we actually experience. It's that sort of anxiety sense, that tightening around the chest where you feel like you don't have enough time in the day to get all the work done that you need to get done. The key takeaway here is for that stress to abate, you really do need to find time to rest. You do need, as Joan talked about, that chance to express your problems with someone who's listening to you, deeply listening, not just sort of, let me see, I got a couple minutes here. I'm gonna, I'll let you, vent a little bit. People who you feel safe with, that you know that they're listening to you, and in a place that's secure. And then again, you feel safe to express sort of the stress that you're feeling on a daily basis. So what are the consequences of chronic stress? Very, very similar to trauma, right? The same sort of reduced personal and professional performance. Um, we have some health problems that come out of that, the mental and the physical that we've already described, and what will lead into the next topic here. There's a danger of an increase in our alcohol use and other unhealthy coping mechanisms. So let's talk first about alcohol use. This is something that, at least for me, when I was in law school, alcohol was sort of central to a lot of different things. When there were law firms came to talk about their practice and all the great reasons why you needed to come and work for them, alcohol was usually involved. Any gathering usually involved alcohol. I think on the theory that if you didn't have that, people wouldn't come. And so alcohol seems for it is fairly central, and it seemed it was accepted. And so that was one of the things that, at least for me, I reached for. Here, though, I think we need to recognize that among our profession, problematic drinking is an issue. And problematic drinking is not an equivalent to alcoholism or substance use disorder or any of those sorts of things. It's just hazardous and possible dependence on alcohol. The general population experiences that at rates of about 6%. Our profession is at 21%. For those who have been in practice less than 10 years or under 30 years old, it's about 32%. These statistics all come from the groundbreaking study done by the ABA in Hazelden back in 2016. It's looking to be updated, but I'm guessing that because these are pre-pandemic, the statistics have probably not gotten better in the interim. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what alcohol use disorder is. It's primary, it's a chronic disease, it's genetic, psychosocial, there are environmental factors involved, it's progressive and fatal. Okay, that's the scientific explanation. I often describe that for me, I reached for alcohol. It was a coping mechanism. It was a way for me to relieve and reduce my stress, or at least I thought that it was. And for some period of time, it did work. It wasn't that it didn't work. It did. It worked really, really well. And I had a lot of what I would say were really fun times while I was drinking with friends. The problem for me is that as I went along, it got worse, and I drank more, and I drank more often, which gets you to that second piece. It's continuous. It's impairing my control over my drinking, how often I drink, how much I drink, and how often am I thinking about it? And the answer is it was pretty much all of the time for me. And I describe it often as it's like one of those old carts that go down the roads of those dirt roads back in the day with those really narrow tires, and it's digging ruts into the road. And the longer I go, the deeper those ruts get, till I got to the point in the end where I really no longer could get back out of those ruts. And that's, to me, the progressive piece. So what are the signs of impairment? On a personal basis, and when Joan talks a little bit about mental health in a minute, what we look for here are changes in appearance, changes in behavior. Am I telling you things that you know for a fact aren't true? I think sometimes we call those lies, but we'll call it distorting the truth. Am I overreacting? Am I just acting really irritable? Is there something different about the way that I'm approaching you or others that seems off? On a professional basis, my production might be flagging. I may not be putting in the hours that I need to put in. My attendance might be flagging. I might be coming in later. I might be leaving earlier. I might be going for longer lunches. And the work that I have to do might get pushed off more and more and more to the point where they become emergencies every time, not just once in a while, every time, as opposed to hey, a client calls and I need something tomorrow. It's like the client called a month ago and they still don't have the agreement that they need. Next slide. So in addition to alcohol, There are other things that we sometimes reach out for. Drugs, obviously, is on that list, but alcohol and drugs are the only two really here that we're talking about that we take into the body. Obviously, eating disorders is on that list too, but in terms of the behavior itself, the others are all behavioral issues. I'm regulating some behavior or I'm engaging in some behavior, whether it's gambling or the internet or sexual compulsivity, shoplifting, all of those things. But each of these activities, each of these things that we do affect us in the same parts of our brain. It impacts the same pleasure center of our brain in ways that become just like the analogy that I used about the wagon. It's going to continue to dig deeper and deeper ruts to the point where it gets harder and harder and harder to stop that behavior to move on and be able to try to do something else. Um, we also do a program on eating disorders, and I would say that one's a difficult one, primarily because only about 6% of the people who experience an eating disorder will appear to be medically underweight. But that doesn't mean that the person that you're looking at is healthy. In fact, they may be incredibly sick. So eating disorders are a true challenge, but we have plenty of resources that we can help you with in that as well. So one of the ways you can look at whether you have a problem or someone else has a problem, and this we're talking about substance use, but you could apply this to the other behaviors as well. Have you ever felt that you needed to cut down on your drinking or on your use or behavior? Have people annoyed you by criticizing your drinking? It's like, listen, John, you might have had a little too much last night. That doesn't usually sit well. Have you ever felt guilty about how much and how often you're drinking? And have you ever had to have that drink in the morning to just open the eye opener to get your nerves settled down and to start the day? And one of the things I would say about this list is I didn't experience all four of those. I didn't really have the eye opener issue for me, at least in my experience. But all the other three were there. And it doesn't have to be all four. It doesn't even have to be three, right? It can be a matter of how often I had people tell me after the fact, they said, listen, I didn't even know you had a problem. And the answer is, yeah, because I'm really good at hiding it. And we are. And sometimes, though, our ability to hide it diminishes over time. So,
And I think this group of questions is also a good one to use when you're concerned about someone. You say, well, I'm not really comfortable with their behavior or the amount that I know they're drinking. And you can think about this and you can say, okay, do I wish they would drink less? Have I said something? And, it's not criticizing necessarily, even just commenting, because that's going to be met with that defensiveness. And that's going to be the case with any other substances, compulsive behaviors. And a lot of times, if someone is in recovery from some sort of substance issue, they are at risk for having a problem with a compulsive behavior because it's that part of the brain that says, I want this and I want it now, no matter what. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what it looks when you move away from that place to a place of recovery. I'm going to spend a little time on some other mental health issues. And John talked earlier about the data that we have from a collaboration between the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs and the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. And they looked at mental health and substance use. And what they found in the study was that just over a quarter of us during our careers met criteria for depression. And they also asked how many of you think you might have been depressed at some point, and that was over 50%, but it wasn't a measuring instrument. And then for anxiety, almost 1 in 5. And I would say that since the pandemic, I would expect that were this survey done today, that anxiety would be a higher number. And then there was also some questions about stress to the point where it would be debilitating at some point, and that was 23% of us. And then when asked the question, have you ever considered suicide? Over 10% of us said yes, which is very concerning because if things feel bad enough that that seems like a reasonable option, that's a whole lot of stress. And suicide can be something where you are actively thinking about it, or it can be something with, if I got hit by a truck today, that would be okay. So if you're finding yourself going in those directions, it's really time to think about talking to someone and getting some help. Depression is something that there's been some good writing, there's some good resources. There's something called the Lawyer's Depression Project, which is on our resource list. And it's where the things that normally brought you pleasure do not. And you don't notice things like the colors of the flowers. And where we notice it in our profession is when we have difficulty concentrating, remembering, or deciding because it affects our work. And we tie that to our status. It's the same with substance use, where if we don't think it's hurting anybody outside of our work, we don't take it as seriously sometimes. And it can happen in stages where you sort of have this low level feeling down, or it can also show up as anger. And then it goes deeper to where you don't feel that there's hope or anyone can help, to the point where suicide may seem like a reasonable option. We all have bad days, it's not that. And often what the experts will say is that, did this persist for more than 2 weeks? From the outside, what we're looking for is a change in behavior. We have talked about, you've got pessimism on this list, and lawyers by trade are pessimist, and you see a lot of other things that can be thought of as typical. But the key is really, is there a change in behavior where there's more of this going on, or that the person has withdrawn and is isolating? And we're not telling you, here's how you diagnose depression. Rather, it's, oh, I see some things that look familiar. Maybe I should talk to somebody about it. And LCL can be that first call where it's like, can I talk to someone about something I am worried about, or I want to find out, or get an evaluation, or whatever it may be? We already mentioned anxiety from the ABA report. And so that definitely is a mental health issue that we are experiencing a lot. I think it's appropriate to be anxious sometimes. It's kind of like stage fright, helps you do your best work, but sometimes it's in inappropriate places. Additional things that lawyers get help for are on this list. Bipolar disorder, which is extreme highs and lows, and it's hard to feel like you need help when you're in the higher place because you feel like you can do anything. OCD is a form of anxiety disorder. Um, ADHD is the reason I have the word health underlined on this slide, because we're talking about health issues. It's a condition. It's a neurobiological condition, and there are various other conditions that are in a similar place where we can function extremely well, and in fact can be really outstanding, excellent lawyers, but we need to have the right accommodations and understanding and support. And LCL has a support group for lawyers with ADHD. I have grief on here because sometimes we don't complete the grief cycle, and I don't think that's really the way to put it, except that because we're never going to stop grieving, but we can't move to a place where it isn't overwhelming us and we can't function because we think we ought to be able to handle it. Um, John talked about trauma, and it can arise to the level of being diagnosed with PTSD. I just talked to a lawyer last week who told me about that diagnosis that they had. And then another thing that happens in our profession, and as we've referred to a couple of times, we've got a program about this too, which is issues of older adults. And of course, cognitive impairment can start earlier. We can be very, very old and be completely lucid, but there is greater risk as we age. And sometimes there are lawyers who need help retiring. And LCL can be a coach on all of these and provide information and support. So as we look at these mental health challenges, here are some questions to ask. In the last 2 weeks, have you been feeling particularly blue and it's continued, or angry or irritated and it's out of sorts for you and it's not changing? Have you lost interest in the things you usually care about, the ability to work, play, love? Have you had trouble concentrating, remembering, or deciding? That's where we notice it, remember? Unusual panic or worrying, not typical for you. Or have you thought about suicide at all? Don't wait 2 weeks, because it's a forever decision, but there are so many ways to find a path around it rather than having that be the way you go. And we and texting 988 and other resources are there to help. Any comments you wanted to make on that piece, John?
No, I think, and again, all of these tests are so predicated on just noticing those changes in behavior, the increment, and sometimes they're incremental. It's a little bit like the boiling frog thing that we often talk about, but it can be you know stark when you look from beginning to end. But sometimes it's a slow progression, and it's just being aware of those things.
Hmm. And what she's talking about with the boiling frog, if you're not familiar with that, is that you don't real when things get hot gradually, you don't notice until it's too hot. Whereas if you jump into something that's hot, you recognize it right away and jump out. But that gradual worsening, and that's why when you're thinking about a colleague and you look at the difference between today and yesterday, there's not that much of a difference, but the difference between today and 6 months ago, there's a pretty big one. I want to talk a minute about ethics because when we are anxious, when we are overwhelmed, we are looking for ways out and we're looking for ways to protect ourselves. So we act rashly and we act in our own self-interest, which can mean that we avoid that thing that is bothering us, which could be the client that wants us to call them back, and we just haven't been able to do it for a week, 2 weeks, months, etc. And if you read discipline cases, you'll see cases where there were repeated assurances that something would happen and it didn't, and it didn't, and it didn't. And it's like, that is not a healthy lawyer. Something's going on there. And when we're experiencing things that are traumatic to us, we avoid those reminders. And so if there's a case where it reminds us of something that happened to us or something we experienced before that was difficult, we might not do that. And then if that client complains, we're going to be spending a whole lot more time with that matter. Some of the rules that are implicated here are competence and diligence. Are we doing our best work and are we doing it in appropriate time? Are we communicating appropriately? Because half of the cases that are opened are communication issues with clients. And so thinking about that it's got to be pretty extreme for that to happen. And so how is that lawyer doing? Um, there is a rule that says that if you are in a supervisory relationship and you are aware of someone not doing what they're supposed to do and at risk of violating the rules in terms of communication, diligence, etc., and you don't do anything, that you could potentially be held responsible. And then there's a rule that I always like to call attention to, which is 8.3, which depending on which bar review course you took is either the squeal rule or the rat on your friends rule. And it's the one where we are required to report a lawyer if we personally know that they have committed misconduct. And the reason I bring that up is because there's an exception. Rule 8.3C says that if a lawyer learns of misconduct by another lawyer while working in a capacity with a lawyer assistance program, either as a staff member like John and I, or as a volunteer, if that's the context in which you learn it, you are not required to report. So it doesn't say we can't, but it says we don't have to, which means it can be a safe harbor for somebody who is like, wow, I've really been in a tough place. I made some mistakes. I know there's going to be consequences. I really don't know what's going to happen next. And we're here to support, and it's absolutely safe. You won't get reported. Now, I've talked about some rules, and here's a comment. The comments guide, the rules govern. And the comment says a lawyer's workload must be controlled so that each matter can be handled competently. And what that does is it gives us permission to say, I want to do my best work. I want to serve my clients or the parties I'm working with as effectively as possible. Therefore, in order to be competent and diligent, I need to be paying attention to whether I have taken on too much. And it gives you a permission to do something about that. And sometimes it means you got to talk to a counselor or a case manager at LCL or somebody else to help you to do that unburdening and figure out how to say no, because sometimes that's the worst thing is that we don't know how to say no. So what can we do about this? Well, we can make sure that everyone within the organization knows that resources are available. that LCL is a resource, that we are all at risk for these challenges, and there's no shame, even though it's hard for us to believe that, in saying I could use some help and support. Within an organization, John had talked about some of the signs. The partners who are looking at the statements of who produced how much in the last quarter, a lot has happened since that was done. And so your other colleagues, the ones who are more in a support role, they're going to know this stuff way before the partners do, or whatever that equivalent level is. So do they feel safe coming to someone and saying, I'm concerned about Joe, or I'm concerned about Mary? And it's kind of the same as do they feel safe if they wanted to report sexual harassment? It could be the same thing. That kind of safety. And then we're happy to provide our information to anybody that wants to spread it out to family members, put it in benefit materials, whatever it may be. And so, John, I think sometimes you talk about this slide, which is some of the ways in which people can reach out either themselves or what we do.
Sure. So in certain recovery circles, a big component of recovery is service. And one of those aspects of service is to talk to other people who might be suffering, people who might need help, people who are struggling, who are looking for some solution. They don't know what it is. They don't think one exists. Even if they know one exists, they don't think it applies to them. Um, One of the most powerful tools in the toolbox is to sit down with someone and just talk to them. So this idea that an expression of concern, well, they're really not going to listen to me. I would say this, they may not always react well in the moment to an expression of concern, but I'll guarantee they heard it. And I will guarantee that there is a part of them that understands that it came from a really good place, a place of care, a place of concern, dare I say a place of love. And I think that is really, really powerful. So if you're looking at someone and you're concerned about them and you're not really sure what to do or what to say, give us a call. We can coach you through those conversations. We can provide additional information for you on how you might be able to sit down with someone. Sometimes, if it's a case of a substance use issue, we can find people who can reach out separately too at some point and sit down with that person and talk about, the fact that recovery is possible. But some of those initial contacts can be really, really critically important. And I'll tell you that often the person that you're going to talk to, they know there's a problem. They're mostly fully aware that there's an issue. They don't know, one, that there's a solution, but two, they may just be thinking, well, nobody notices. Nobody, it's not affecting anyone else. Sometimes that reaching out and an expression of concern can be a revelation in and of itself that, oh, I guess I'm not hiding it as well as I thought. And so we can help you in any number of ways. We can do some direct outreach. We can do more formal interventions, the kind of things you sometimes see on TV, where people sit down and with family members, friends, colleagues, and read letters. It can be that formal and it can be much less formal. We can do all kinds of things in between. And we also have crisis response resources available as well for those kinds of things that, death of a colleague, those kinds of things that we can draw upon when the need arises.
Thanks, John. And so we kind of meet people where they are. And we will do what we do based on the conversation we might have with you if you're concerned about someone. And if you say, okay, you don't have to give us their name, you don't have to give us your name, we can have that conversation. That's what confidentiality looks like. But I also want to talk about this concept, which means that you might be ready, but they're not. And this is called the stages of change, and it's something that's often used in a therapeutic context. And so just think about how you've identified an issue. And so it might be that, I think I could be in better shape, but I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything. And then the next step is contemplation, where it's like, well, I could do something. I wonder where I might go. And oh, look, there's a Y, like 5 blocks from my house. Okay, well, that's good. I know something. And then stage 3 is preparation, where you start to do things. You might look up and what the schedule is, what the costs are, what's involved in going, and start making some preparation to do it. Do I have to buy some shoes? You know, my running shoes are 40 years old or 20 years old or whatever it is. And then you start doing it. You actually show up, you actually do it, and you do it again, and then you do it some more times. And then it starts to become part of your life. And there's a circle here because it can happen again. And recovery from any kind of issue can be the same, where I don't really like how I'm feeling about this. And it takes a while before you can take a step. So, what you might do with talking to someone is you may move them from pre contemplation to contemplation. And that's okay because they've taken that step and they're starting to think about it. And in a way, we always have permission to tell these stories. One of our volunteers said, people came to talk to me about my drinking 5 years before I stopped. It was never as much fun after that. And then they eventually went into recovery and were a very strong volunteer. I also want to take you through this very, very basic way to talk to someone. And this is the format that we often use in talking to people about how you might have that conversation with someone. And so you start out with, I'm concerned about you, and you establish that relationship. Um, you might give some examples. You might say that it's a hard conversation. And then you give specific evidence. This is something that happened. And you don't want to overwhelm them, and you want it to be specific. And then you say how it impacts you because they weren't hurting anybody else, but now somebody else is affected. And that's hard to do, but it makes a difference. And then you listen, see what they have to say, because it may be, I haven't known where to start. I haven't had any idea what to do. You know, they're just like, finally they can start. Other times not, but you listen. And you have a game plan. Here's what I'd like you to do. Have specific goals, have ideas. Here's what I have available for you. And here's what I'll do to support you. Sometimes if somebody's totally resistant and you're in a position where the conduct can't continue, that I will also becomes what I will have to do. But this is the protocol we walk people through and can help you in deciding what you have to do. So, John, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of that beginning recovery process?
Sure. So as Joan talked about with the stages of change, I think the thing that I would emphasize in there that recovery is often sort of a two steps backward, one step back, sometimes two steps or even three steps back, but it's usually a progression. So recovery from substance use starts with, okay, I guess I can't drink anymore. I can't use anymore. So you start there. And then you go down this list. This is actually a very, very good list. You look for support. You look for other folks who have done it to see how they did it. You start to change your habits. You start to dismantle your own ego a little bit, and you try to spiritually center yourself. And then this last one, service to others. Those are, I mean, it's a rough approximation of a certain 12-step program in terms of what kinds of things you need to do. When you look at mental health issues, it's really very similar in some ways, although there's some differences. You might start engaging in therapy. Medications are not always necessary, but sometimes they are. And it's a predicate really to being able to develop tools that can help you. So medications are sometimes things that you need to take a look at. Just like sobriety, support groups are really, really important. Being able to talk to someone else who's been there, who understands where you're coming from, who's felt the way that you do, or at least has had similar experiences to you. And leaning in on your support system, which can include your family, your friends, work, all of those things. And then again, that last piece, service. So the two, I think, things that really do sort of coexist in both of these lists that are critically important is support from others, providing support to others through service. And I think that's what recovery looks like. And I will just say, I mean, editorially, it's a beautiful process and it can be a frustrating process, but it's one that I have never regretted in all of these 24 years. So what happens? Before we seek help, we're high functioning, but we're miserable. We're not doing well. Our relationships are failing. They're superficial at best. We're just scratching the surface. We're not our authentic selves at all. We're lying to ourselves and to other people in terms of who we are. We might feel depressed, full of anxiety. You start to feel like a fraud, like, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? And then that sense of doom impending and holding over your head. And afterwards, it's the country song played backwards, I suppose. you start to see that personal and professional fulfillment that you weren't seeing before. Your relationships get better because you're showing up now. You're showing up authentically, even in pain, right? You start to feel more confident and content. I would say though, this isn't something that you expect. This happens on day one. This is something that takes time. So that last comment there is really the most important with this. This is a journey, not a destination. And you when you work it, it will improve, but it's going to take time. And I always say, one of my first sponsors said, I wish for you a long recovery, and I would wish for anyone entering recovery for the same thing.
Thanks, John. I mean, it's like this is what it looks like. There are so many ways in which people can find a different way to live and a different way to feel with the right support, and that's who we are. I want to spend just the little time we have left talking about some of the things that are available to you as tools you can use in developing resilience and being able to reduce your risk with the understanding that we didn't get rid of level one trauma centers when we got airbags. We still need the support for people. You may put all of the well-being strategies in place that you can, and yes, and these things might still happen, but you have tools and people get better. And sometimes we have to go through some things in order to get where we need to go. And so a report called The Path to Lawyer Wellbeing came out after the data about impairment, and they looked at a lot of different aspects of well-being. And I think what's important here is they have this diagram with areas of well-being, and you've got occupational and intellectual up on top, which of course that's our status, right? But the other things are foundational, are emotional, social, physical, spiritual, and the fact that we look at everything through a cultural lens, which can mean many things. And so if you don't have your foundation in place, you're not going to do your best thinking. And that's the foundation of what we're talking about here. So building resilience are these are tactics and tools you can learn. And both the doctors and the Army have talked about resilience. And I like the Army's definition, which is bouncing back from adversity. We can tolerate stress better, we get better more quickly, and we have diminished risk for mental health issues. It can enhance our immunity, which 5 years ago would have been nice, but now we care. And it also makes us feel less like we're threatened by something else. And we're able to analyze more effectively. So here are just a very few strategies. We have whole programs that offer many more and much more information. We had talked about pessimism earlier, and why don't we look at whether we can be flexible about that? Because you might have to play a pessimist, but you don't have to take that into the rest of your life. So always having this idea that the worst is going to happen unless I somehow write the perfect contract. Um, Maybe that doesn't have to be your attitude at home or in running your law firm or what other workplace you're in. And so thinking about how do I look at this in a positive way? And there are practices you can engage in. Doing it daily, doing it regularly, where even when you have a setback, saying, okay, this was not good. However, what did I learn? What can I do with this? Because I can't change what happened. And that is an optimistic style of looking at it. We are often our own worst critics. And so to think about that pessimistic style takes us there. And where are we right now? And how can I claim what I need in order to be able to do my best? And that means sometimes drawing good boundaries. And that's going to be with different categories of people. And it's also going to be within the various areas of well-being. Do you feel safe? Does it seem reasonable? Have you allowed what is happening? And if you're feeling like something happened that I wasn't comfortable with, what can I do next time? What do I wish I'd said? And this is also the kind of thing where you can think about interrupting when someone makes a insensitive comment about mental health. We do some programs on bias where we talk about bias about mental health issues and what we can do to change our own viewpoints as well as to respond when others do things that we're uncomfortable with. We can look at how we perceive things. We can look at what's the worst that could happen if we have a stressful situation. We can easily get there. And what do we have to do? Sometimes nothing will make the worst happen. What's the best that could happen and what can I do? Which puts you in the driver's seat instead of being the passenger or the victim. There's only so many things you can control. And so what are they? And the others you sometimes have to let go. And then how do we find meaning in the work we do? Thinking about that, how am I making a difference before today? Because that is an antidote to burnout. And so how can you think about what you're doing in terms of the conversation I'm going to have with the person today? How am I going to craft that conversation so it is something where they feel like they were heard and I feel like I did a good job? Thinking about that instead of the thing on your to-do list. And then asking for help when you need it. And there's other places to get help, but we're the one that I'm going to talk about. We're here as an organization that provides free and confidential support on any issue that causes stress or distress. And we are funded by your license fees in part. So you're already paying for it. Why not use it? And we're absolutely confidential. We refer to licensed professionals for free counseling across the state of Minnesota, virtual or in person. We have a variety of support groups. John runs one for solo small practitioners. We have one for people dealing with discipline issues. We have one when it's a family issue. We have a parenting group we co-sponsor with Minnesota Women Lawyers. We have an ADHD group. We have a general well-being group, and we have career support. We have peer support, and we'll come to your organization if you're with a firm or governmental division or whatever, where you'd like something within your group. We contract with this organization, the Sand Creek Group, and if you have an EAP at your work, sometimes you can stack benefits, but it's an employee assistance program, but we work very hard to help the lawyers understand legal professional stress. And our materials have information about them, and you can contact them directly as well. And we encourage you to follow our well-being tips on social media. So I want to thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate the time you've taken and the opportunity to be here. John, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I've always loved this last slide. There is help and hope. And if you're wondering how I know that, it's because that's what I found when I called too.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for attending. We are at 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and conclude here. For those of you that asked,